The desert heat of Fallujah pressed down like a heavy blanket as Marine Corps medic Sarah Chen adjusted her gear one final time. At 24, she had already served 2 tours, but something about this mission felt different. The intelligence report spoke of a high-value target hiding in the maze of concrete buildings ahead, and her unit was tasked with providing medical support during the extraction. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Oregon, where her father ran a hardware store and her mother worked as a school nurse. The idea of serving her country had always burned bright in her heart, even as a child watching military parades on television. When she enlisted, her parents worried about their daughter's safety, but they also swelled with pride at her determination to make a difference. The morning briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence suggested the target was holed up in a residential compound on the eastern edge of the city. The area was known for heavy insurgent activity, but the mission was deemed crucial for ongoing operations in the region. Sarah's role was clear: stay with the support team, provide medical assistance to wounded soldiers, and help evacuate any civilians caught in the crossfire. As her convoy rolled through the dusty streets, Sarah checked her medical supplies for the 3rd time: bandages, morphine, IV bags, tourniquets, everything a field medic needed to save lives in the chaos of combat. She had used these supplies countless times before, patching up fellow Marines under fire and earning their respect through her calm professionalism under pressure. The radio crackled with updates from the lead vehicle. They were approaching the target area, and early reconnaissance showed unusual quiet in the normally bustling neighborhood. Sarah's commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, reminded everyone to stay alert. In Fallujah, silence often meant danger was waiting just around the corner. The convoy came to a halt 3 blocks from the target compound. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and followed her team as they moved on foot through narrow alleyways. The smell of cooking spices mixed with dust and diesel fuel filled the air. Laundry hung from balconies above, and children's toys scattered in doorways told stories of families trying to live normal lives amid the chaos of war. Sarah had learned to read the rhythm of the city during her previous deployments. She could sense when something was wrong, when the usual sounds of daily life gave way to an ominous stillness. Today that feeling gnawed at her stomach as they approached their objective. Local residents seemed to have vanished from the streets, and even the stray dogs that usually roamed the area were nowhere to be. The assault team moved ahead while Sarah's medical unit set up a casualty collection point in a partially destroyed building 2 blocks away. From her position, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters and the occasional burst of radio chatter. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but Sarah's instincts told her to prepare for the worst. As she organized her medical supplies and checked her communications equipment, Sarah thought about the letters she had written to her family the night before. She always wrote letters before dangerous missions, storing them in her footlocker back at base. In them, she tried to explain why this work mattered to her, why she believed in the mission even when things got difficult. The first explosion shattered the morning calm like thunder. Sarah's radio immediately came alive with urgent voices calling for medical support. Multiple casualties were reported, and the assault team was requesting immediate evacuation assistance. Sarah shouldered her medical bag and prepared to move forward, knowing that the next few hours would test everything she had learned about saving lives under fire. Her heart pounded as she ran toward the sound of gunfire, but her hands remained steady. This was what she had trained for, what she had volunteered for. In these moments, the abstract concept of service became very real and very personal. Sarah Chen was about to face the greatest challenge of her military career, though she had no way of knowing just how dramatically her life was about to change. The compound erupted in chaos as Sarah and her medical team rushed toward the sound of heavy gunfire. What was supposed to be a quick extraction had turned into a full-scale firefight. Through her radio, she could hear the desperate voices of soldiers calling for medical assistance, their words punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper rumble of explosions. Sarah's team leader, Sergeant Mike Johnson, led them through a series of damaged buildings toward the action. Johnson was a veteran with 15 years of service, and Sarah had learned to trust his judgment completely. His calm demeanor under pressure had saved countless lives during their previous missions together, and today would be no different. As they moved closer to the compound, the intensity of the battle became clear. The assault team had walked into a well-prepared ambush. Intelligence had been wrong about the number of insurgents in the area, and what should have been a simple operation had become a deadly trap. The enemy had positioned themselves in multiple buildings surrounding the target compound, creating crossfire that pinned down the advancing Marines. Sarah's first patient was a young corporal named Danny Martinez, barely 19 years old. He had taken shrapnel to his leg when an improvised explosive device detonated near his position. As Sarah worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize his condition, she could see the fear in his eyes mixed with determination to get back to his squad. Danny kept asking about his fellow Marines, more concerned about their safety than his own injuries. The building they were using as a medical station came under direct fire as Sarah treated Martinez. Bullets shattered windows and sent concrete chips flying through the air. Sergeant Johnson returned fire while Sarah continued her work, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She had learned to block out the noise and focus entirely on her patient's needs. Radio reports indicated that the assault team was trapped in the target building with multiple casualties. The insurgents had used the initial explosion as a signal to begin their coordinated attack from concealed positions throughout the neighborhood. Sarah's commanding officer made the difficult decision to send her forward, with a small security team to reach the wounded Marines who couldn't be evacuated to the rear. The journey to the compound took Sarah through the most dangerous part of the battlefield. She moved in short rushes between cover, her medical bag heavy on her shoulder and her rifle ready for action. Despite being a medic, Sarah was a trained Marine first, and she knew how to fight when necessary. The enemy didn't distinguish between combatants and medical personnel. Inside the compound, Sarah found a scene of devastation. 3 Marines had been seriously wounded when a rocket-propelled grenade struck their position. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, had suffered severe injuries to his chest and was losing blood rapidly. Sarah immediately began working to stabilize him, while enemy fire continued to rain down on their position. The second wounded Marine, Private First Class Jennifer Liu, had taken multiple bullet wounds to her arm and shoulder. Despite her injuries, Liu was still returning fire and helping to defend their position. Sarah admired the young Marine's courage as she worked to dress her wounds and administer pain medication. Liu insisted on staying in the fight rather than being evacuated. The third casualty was the most serious. Lance Corporal Tommy Wilson had been closest to the RPG impact and had suffered traumatic injuries that required immediate surgery. Sarah knew that Wilson's only chance of survival was getting him to a field hospital as quickly as possible. But the enemy fire made evacuation impossible at the moment. As Sarah worked on Wilson, she noticed movement in the building across the street. Insurgents were repositioning themselves for another attack, and she realized they were about to be overrun. She grabbed her rifle and added her own fire to the defensive effort, while continuing to monitor Wilson's vital signs. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah knew they needed help soon. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with news that reinforcements were on the way, but they were still 20 minutes out. Sarah looked at her patients and made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She volunteered to stay with the wounded Marines while the rest of the team attempted to break out of the compound and reach safety. Sergeant Johnson argued against the plan, but Sarah was determined. Someone needed to keep the wounded Marines alive, and she was the only medic in the building. As enemy fire intensified and their ammunition ran low, Sarah prepared herself for the fight of her life. She had no idea that in the next few minutes her own survival would hang in the balance. The attack came without warning, a coordinated assault that shattered the fragile calm Sarah had managed to create in the compound. Enemy fighters had moved through underground tunnels and emerged in the building next door, catching the defending Marines completely off guard. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air as bullets began punching through the walls around them. Sarah was checking Lance Corporal Wilson's pulse when the first insurgent appeared at the doorway. Time seemed to slow as she reached for her rifle, but the enemy fighter was faster. The burst of gunfire that followed would forever change her life and create a story that would inspire Marines for generations to come. The first bullet struck Sarah in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her medical bag flying across the room. The impact felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, and for a moment, she couldn't understand what had happened. The second and third rounds hit her chest, protected partially by her body armor, but still delivering devastating force that knocked her to the ground. Staff Sergeant Hayes, despite his own serious injuries, managed to return fire and eliminate the immediate threat, but more insurgents were moving through the building. Sarah tried to stand but found that her legs wouldn't respond properly. Looking down, she saw blood spreading across her uniform and realized she had been hit multiple times. The 4th through 7th bullets found their mark as Sarah attempted to crawl toward her wounded patients. Each impact sent shock waves through her body, but somehow she remained conscious and focused on her mission. Private First Class Lou was screaming for help, her earlier wounds having reopened during the firefight, and Wilson was going into shock from blood loss. Sarah's training took over even as her own life ebbed away. Using her uninjured arm, she managed to reach her medical supplies and began treating Lou's wounds while applying pressure to her own injuries with her other hand. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was simultaneously patient and doctor, victim and rescuer. The 8th and 9th bullets came from a different direction as more insurgents entered the compound. One round shattered Sarah's left leg while another grazed her head, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. Blood flowed into her eyes, making it difficult to see clearly, but she could still hear Wilson's labored breathing and knew he was running out of time. Sergeant Johnson's voice crackled through the radio, reporting that reinforcements were still 10 minutes away. Sarah knew that none of them would survive that long without immediate action. Despite her multiple wounds, she managed to drag herself to the window and began returning fire, using the last of her strength to buy time for her patients. The 10th, 11th, and 12th bullets struck Sarah almost simultaneously as she exposed herself to protect the wounded Marines. The impact knocked her unconscious for several seconds, and when she came to, she found herself lying in a pool of her own blood. Her vision was fading, and she could feel her strength leaving her body. But Sarah Chen was not ready to give up. Summoning reserves of willpower she didn't know she possessed, she forced herself to remain conscious and continued treating her patients. Wilson's breathing was becoming more shallow, and she knew he needed a blood transfusion immediately. Using supplies from her medical bag, she began the complex process of setting up an IV line with hands that shook from trauma and blood loss. The 13th and 14th bullets came as Sarah was completing Wilson's IV setup. One round struck her in the back, while the other shattered her right wrist. The pain was indescribable, but somehow she managed to finish connecting the life-saving fluid that would keep Wilson alive until help arrived. As Sarah lay bleeding on the floor of the compound, she could hear the distant sound of approaching helicopters. The reinforcements Johnson had promised were finally arriving, but she wasn't sure she would live to see them. Her vision was darkening around the edges, and she could feel her heart struggling to pump blood through her damaged body. In what she thought might be her final moments, Sarah looked at the 3 wounded Marines she had fought so hard to save. Hayes was conscious and holding pressure on his chest wound. Lou was stable and alert, and Wilson's breathing had improved since receiving the IV fluids. Despite her own critical condition, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her patients would survive. The sound of gunfire began to fade as the reinforcements engaged the remaining insurgents throughout the compound. Sarah could hear American voices calling out orders and coordinating the evacuation of wounded personnel. Help was finally arriving, but she had paid a terrible price to keep her patients alive until rescue came. As her consciousness began to slip away, Sarah's last thought was of her parents back in Oregon and the letters she had written the night before. She wondered if they would ever know how much their support had meant to her and how proud she was to serve her country and her fellow Marines. The military medical team that found Sarah in the compound couldn't believe she was still alive. Navy Corpsman First Class. David Park had seen plenty of combat casualties during his 4 deployments, but he had never encountered someone who had survived 14 gunshot wounds while continuing to treat other patients. Sarah was unconscious when they reached her, but her vital signs showed she was still fighting for life. The evacuation to the field hospital was a race against time. Sarah had lost massive amounts of blood, and her body was going into shock from the trauma. The medical helicopter crew worked frantically during the short flight, establishing multiple IV lines and administering emergency medications to stabilize her condition. Every minute counted, and they weren't sure she would survive the journey. Dr. Amanda Foster, the trauma surgeon on duty at the field hospital, had performed thousands of emergency operations during her military career. But Sarah's case presented unique challenges. The bullets had damaged multiple organs, fractured several bones, and caused internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. The medical team would need to work for hours to repair all the damage. The first surgery lasted 8 hours as Dr. Foster and her team methodically addressed each of Sarah's injuries. They removed bullet fragments from her chest, repaired damaged blood vessels in her abdomen, and stabilized fractures in her leg and wrist. The surgery was complicated by Sarah's severe blood loss, requiring multiple transfusions to keep her alive during the procedure. When Sarah finally woke up 3 days later, she found herself surrounded by machines and medical equipment in the intensive care unit. Her body felt like it was on fire and she couldn't move without excruciating pain. Nurse Captain Maria Santos was the first person she saw, and the relief in Santos's eyes told Sarah just how close she had come to dying. The road to recovery was longer and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Sarah's injuries had caused nerve damage that affected her ability to walk, and doctors weren't sure if she would ever regain full mobility. Physical therapy sessions were agony, but Sarah approached them with the same determination she had shown on the battlefield. News of Sarah's heroic actions in Fallujah began to spread throughout the military community. The 3 Marines she had saved, Hayes, Lou, and Wilson, all survived their injuries and credited Sarah with keeping them alive during the most dangerous moments of the firefight. Their testimony painted a picture of extraordinary courage under the most extreme circumstances. Colonel James Mitchell, Sarah's commanding officer, visited her in the hospital and informed her that she was being recommended for the Navy Cross, one of the highest military decorations for valor. Sarah was overwhelmed by the honor, but insisted that she had simply done her job as a Marine and a medic. She was more interested in hearing about the welfare of her patients than discussing her own recognition. The media attention that followed was both overwhelming and unwanted. Sarah had never sought fame or recognition for her service, and she struggled with being labeled a hero when so many other Marines had made similar sacrifices. She preferred to focus on her recovery and getting back to active duty, rather than giving interviews or attending ceremonies. Physical therapy became Sarah's new battlefield. Every day brought small victories and frustrating setbacks as she worked to regain strength and mobility. Her left leg had been severely damaged, and doctors had initially told her that she might never walk normally again. Sarah refused to accept that prognosis and pushed herself harder than her therapists recommended. The support from her fellow Marines was overwhelming. Soldiers she had never met sent letters and care packages, sharing their own stories of recovery and offering encouragement. Hayes, Lou, and Wilson visited whenever they could, often bringing updates from their units and reminders of why Sarah's sacrifice had been so important. Dr. Foster became not just Sarah's surgeon, but also her advocate and friend. She had seen many wounded warriors struggle with the psychological trauma of their injuries, and she was determined to help Sarah overcome both her physical and emotional challenges. Foster arranged for counseling sessions and connected Sarah with other wounded veterans who had successfully returned to active duty. The most difficult part of Sarah's recovery wasn't the physical pain or the long hours of therapy. It was the doubt that crept into her mind during quiet moments, the fear that she might not be able to return to the work that had defined her identity. Being a Marine medic wasn't just her job, it was who she was, and the thought of losing that scared her more than any enemy bullet. After 6 months of intensive rehabilitation, Sarah reached a milestone that her doctors had thought impossible. She took her first unassisted steps down the hospital corridor, her legs shaky but supporting her weight. The moment was captured by a photographer who happened to be visiting the hospital, and the image would later become a symbol of resilience and determination for wounded warriors everywhere. Sarah's determination to return to active duty never wavered, even when well-meaning friends and family suggested she consider a medical retirement. She knew that her recovery was far from complete, but she also knew that she had more to give to her country and her fellow Marines. The question wasn't whether she would return to duty, but when and in what capacity she would be able to serve again. 18 months after the incident in Fallujah, Sarah stood at the entrance to Marine Corps Base Quantico, her dress uniform pressed and her medals gleaming in the morning sun. The Navy Cross on her chest felt heavier than its actual weight, a constant reminder of the day that had changed everything. Today was special. She was returning to active duty, though in a capacity very different from her previous role as a field medic. The journey back had been filled with challenges that extended far beyond physical recovery. Sarah had undergone dozens of surgeries to repair damage from her wounds, And while she had regained most of her mobility, she still walked with a slight limp that served as a permanent reminder of that day in the compound. More difficult to overcome were the nightmares and flashbacks that haunted her sleep. Post-traumatic stress disorder had been Sarah's most stubborn enemy. The sound of helicopters could send her into a panic, and crowded spaces made her feel trapped and vulnerable. With the help of military psychologists and her own determination, she had learned coping strategies that allowed her to function normally most of the time. But the struggle was ongoing and required constant vigilance. Sarah's new assignment was as an instructor at the Field Medical Training Battalion, where she would teach combat medicine to the next generation of Marine medics. The role was both an honor and a challenge. She would be sharing hard-won knowledge with young Marines who reminded her of herself just a few years earlier. The responsibility of preparing them for the realities of combat weighed heavily on her mind. Her first class consisted of 24 Marines, fresh from basic training and eager to learn the skills that would help them save lives on the battlefield. As Sarah limped into the classroom that first morning, she could see the recognition in their eyes. Most of them had heard her story, and some seemed almost intimidated to be learning from someone they considered a legend. Sarah quickly established that she wanted no special treatment or reverence in her classroom. She was there to teach life-saving skills, not to be admired for past actions. Her teaching style was demanding but fair, emphasizing the practical realities of combat medicine over textbook theory. She shared real experiences from her deployments, helping her students understand the chaos and pressure they would face in the field. The most powerful lessons came when Sarah discussed the importance of continuing to function under extreme stress. She would tell her students about treating patients while under fire, about making life-or-death decisions in seconds, and about the responsibility that came with being the person others depended on for survival. Her credibility was unquestioned because her students knew she had lived through everything she taught them. Outside the classroom, Sarah struggled with the transition from being a patient to being an instructor. She missed the immediacy and intensity of field medicine, the feeling of making a direct difference in someone's life during their most vulnerable moment. Teaching was important work, but it felt removed from the action that had defined her military career. The media attention continued to follow Sarah wherever she went. Journalists wanted to interview her, documentary filmmakers sought to tell her story, and veterans organizations invited her to speak at events. While Sarah appreciated the platform to advocate for wounded warriors and military medical personnel, she often felt uncomfortable with the attention and preferred to focus on her teaching responsibilities. One of Sarah's most challenging students was a young Marine named Alex Rodriguez, whose older brother had been killed in Afghanistan. Rodriguez was talented but reckless, often taking unnecessary risks during training exercises. Sarah recognized the anger and guilt that drove his behavior because she had experienced similar emotions during her own recovery. Sarah spent extra time with Rodriguez, sharing her own struggles with survivor's guilt and the importance of channeling difficult emotions into positive action. She helped him understand that being a good medic wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing the job anyway. The mentoring relationship became one of the most rewarding aspects of Sarah's new role. As her first year as an instructor progressed, Sarah began to find new purpose in her work. She received letters from former students who were deployed overseas, thanking her for the training that had helped them save lives in combat. These messages reminded her that her influence extended far beyond the classroom, and that her experience in Fallujah continued to make a difference. The physical challenges of her injuries remained constant. Sarah required ongoing medical treatment and physical therapy to maintain her mobility and manage chronic pain. Some days were better than others, and she learned to adapt her teaching schedule around her physical limitations without letting her students know when she was struggling. Sarah also became involved in advocacy work for wounded veterans, particularly those dealing with traumatic injuries and PTSD. She testified before Congress about the need for improved medical care and support services, using her own experience to illustrate the long-term challenges faced by wounded warriors. Her testimony was powerful because it came from someone who had lived through the entire journey, from injury to recovery. The recognition and awards continued to accumulate, but Sarah remained focused on the future rather than the past. She was working on a training manual that would incorporate lessons learned from recent conflicts, hoping to improve the preparation of military medical personnel for the realities of modern warfare. The project represented her commitment to ensuring that future generations of medics would be better prepared than she had been. As Sarah prepared for her second year as an instructor, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that day in Fallujah. She was no longer the same person who had rushed into that compound to save wounded Marines, but she was still driven by the same sense of duty and commitment to her fellow service members. 5 years after Fallujah, Sarah Chen stood before an assembly of Navy SEALs at their training facility in Coronado, California. The invitation to speak to these elite warriors was an honor she had never imagined receiving. As she walked across the stage, her slight limp barely noticeable after years of physical therapy, the entire audience rose to their feet in a spontaneous salute that brought tears to her eyes. The moment was captured by photographers and would later become an iconic image representing the respect that Special Operations forces had for Sarah's sacrifice and service. These were men who had faced their own battles and understood the true cost of courage under fire. Their salute was not just recognition of her actions in Fallujah, but acknowledgement of her continued service and dedication to training the next generation of military medical personnel. Sarah's speech that day focused on the theme of resilience and the importance of never giving up, regardless of the obstacles faced. She spoke about the dark moments during her recovery, when she questioned whether she would ever be whole again, and how she had learned that strength comes not from the absence of fear or pain, but from the decision to continue moving forward despite both. The SEALs listened intently as Sarah described the ongoing challenges of living with traumatic injuries and PTSD. She emphasized that seeking help was not a sign of weakness but an essential part of the recovery process. Many of the operators in the audience had dealt with their own invisible wounds, and Sarah's honesty about her struggles gave them permission to address their own challenges. After her speech, Sarah was approached by Master Chief Petty Officer James Wilson, a veteran SEAL with multiple deployments who had been following her story since the incident in Fallujah. Wilson told her that her example had inspired many in the Special Operations community to reconsider their own approaches to dealing with combat trauma and injuries. The connection with the SEAL community led to new opportunities for Sarah to expand her influence. Beyond the Marine Corps, she began developing specialized training programs for Special Operations medics, incorporating lessons learned from her own experience and the feedback she had received from students over the years. The programs emphasized not just technical medical skills but also the psychological resilience needed to function effectively under extreme stress. Sarah's personal life had also undergone significant changes during her recovery and return to active duty. She had married Dr. Michael Torres, a Navy psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans with PTSD. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual understanding of the challenges faced by wounded warriors and their families. Torres had been instrumental in helping Sarah work through her own psychological trauma. The couple's wedding had been a gathering of military medical personnel from all branches of service, including many of Sarah's former students and the 3 Marines she had saved in Fallujah. Hayes, Liu, and Wilson all served in the wedding party, their presence serving as a reminder of the bonds forged in combat and the lives that had been saved through Sarah's sacrifice. Professionally, Sarah had been promoted to the rank of Major and was now leading the development of new combat medical training protocols for the entire Marine Corps. Her innovations in trauma care and stress inoculation training were being adopted by military medical units worldwide, extending her influence far beyond her own service branch. The training manual Sarah had been working on was finally published and became required reading for all military medical personnel. The book, titled Under Fire: Combat Medicine in the Modern Battlefield, combined technical medical information with real-world case studies and psychological preparation techniques. It was praised by military leaders and medical professionals for its practical approach to preparing medics for the realities of combat. Sarah also established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting wounded veterans and their families during the long process of recovery and reintegration. The organization provided financial assistance, counseling services, and advocacy support for veterans dealing with combat-related injuries and trauma. The work gave Sarah a sense of purpose that extended beyond her military duties. Despite all her achievements and recognition, Sarah remained humble about her actions in Fallujah. When asked about that day during interviews, she consistently redirected attention to the sacrifices made by all military personnel and the importance of supporting wounded veterans. She never sought to be labeled a hero, and often expressed discomfort with the attention her story received. The nightmares and flashbacks continued to be part of Sarah's life, though they had become less frequent and intense over the years. She had learned to manage her PTSD through therapy, medication, and the support of her husband and fellow veterans. Her openness about these ongoing challenges helped reduce the stigma surrounding mental health issues in the military. As Sarah looked toward the future, she was planning to retire from active duty and focus full-time on her nonprofit work and writing. She wanted to continue telling the stories of wounded veterans and advocating for improved care and support services. Her experience had taught her that recovery was possible but required sustained effort and comprehensive support. The legacy of that day in Fallujah continued to ripple outward through the lives Sarah touched as an instructor, advocate, an example of resilience. The Marines she trained carried her lessons with them to battlefields around the world, and the veterans she helped, through her nonprofit work, were able to rebuild their lives and contribute to their communities. Standing before those Navy SEALs and receiving their salute was a moment that crystallized everything. Sarah had learned about courage, sacrifice, and service. She had been shot 14 times but had never truly fallen because she had found the strength to stand again, not just for herself, but for all those who needed her to remain standing.